This is Duke University.
The project that I'm working on at the moment, Cassava Westerns, is trying to think about why the American frontier myth comes up so much in various black artists' work. And to put it in a context at the moment, I think that current events have been all too helpful in focusing our attention on the arbitrary violence and groundless detentions that police power can impose, and on the wages of toxic white masculinity's continuing enthrallment with manifest destiny. With a man occupying the office of president who misunderstands his power as a law unto itself, the roughness of frontier justice and the vigilantism that operates under cover of law and order are all too pressing. One way to slip the grip of the lawman is to steal away, to wear the mask whose myriad subtleties multiply, interanimate, and undo genre, classification, and quantification of the human. So I want to start in another tongue with a mediation on how without fraternity ain't no liberty or equality. This is thinking back to the Bundy brothers' occupation of Oregon a couple years ago, which I think is very much of that order. Bundy ain't no brother to me, made manifest, destined for loss. His siege come and gone, one oft in a gun-riddled pickup truck, but no standing down. That ground was not rock, all forest and no trees. Ain't no castle we king, crooked out of both salt shores. Our sunken elders anchor us. Black is jumping overboard. Black ain't. Black will climb back on board. Over my head ain't nothing great or gone, ain't my folk guarding freedom. Every once in a while, guns marshal a goat path through the crowds. A little black girl braves the spit. Spite it all, she walks into the school. Ain't no bus come for her in Little Rock. Another time, she's all for, all felled down. One time, 17, another 18, 12, driving down a Texas road, or dragged down in that number. A roll call of all the white knights would repossess, but we gone, long gone, when Frederick Douglass rolled over and wrote out a bond note all over again, a promissory time called nation. Ballot opened, it was gone. Ballot closing, those good old boys still can't find it. America's spell unspun looks like a suicide bomb. History turned inside out. Ain't no kin of mine running wild in Oregon, all man and no brothering, all rage and no anger, all claim and no proof, all cowboy and no corral, no cloud, no witness. Can't even get that. Black is, and black ain't studying that. Hear us rustling down below. So what I want to look at now is some of that rustling. The section of Cassava Westerns that I'm going to share started off as an invitation to speak at Oklahoma State University. I had to get over my parochial reaction to visiting flyover country. But I realized that it was an incredible invitation to get to know Oklahoma's historic all-black towns. Let me see if I can choreograph this a little bit more sensibly. Black Oklahoma has now grown into a whole chapter thinking about the Back to Africa scheme of Chief Alfred Sam, Toni Morrison's neglected novel Paradise, Khalil Joseph's beautiful short Wildcat, and Jacques Courcille's album Trails of Tears, which pairs the middle passage with the Indian removal and the Trail of Tears that ends in Tahlequah. Oklahoma. My previous research has focused on intersections and exchanges among Black cultures in a global context, and what I learned in how residents like Grayson, Oklahoma's mayor, Leon Anderson, map their lives challenged me to explore the unique ways that Black Oklahoma constitutes a crucial world historical site for reorienting diaspora. Okay. Well, the quote that he shares in a short documentary is that what matters to him is that he can get anywhere in the world from Grayson, Oklahoma. And it's a town of maybe 200 or 300 people, but a town that's very proud of its municipal traditions and of its place in the world. And it has no sense of remoteness or isolation, which really struck me. In any case, reading Oklahoma as Black groundation has challenged my assumptions of what's local and what's global and sent me wandering along back roads in what Edouard Glissant would call errance, a noble errancy. And the film I want to discuss today is James Samuel's 2014 film, They Die by Dawn, set in Langston, another Black Oklahoma town, in 1890. And this also comes out of an interest in Black celebrity from a panel that I'd been on some time ago. And I'm trying to track the ways that Samuel plays with fame, putting oneself on the map, earning a reputation, celebrating the self as a possible tactic for surviving notoriety, the condition of always already being under surveillance, driving, walking, doing X while Black. Because the Old West is conventionally set in the second half of the 19th century, punctuated by emancipation and the Dawes Act of 1887, Westerns overlay the iconography of slavery and settler colonialism in uncanny ways. Work by Simone Brown on surveillance highlights, for example, the parallels between the written physiological descriptions in runaway slave notices and subsequent illustrated wanted posters. But Brown reminds us that the genre of such notices could also be inverted, highlighting the terrorism of racialized slavery on either side of the Mason-Dixon line. So there's ways in which the visual here reproduces some of the physical descriptions in words that were often in runaway slave notices and points out the predation of the police power there. The figure of the outlaw is heroic in many Black renditions because of their proximity to the tradition of marronage and fugitivity, which is so easily activated. Celebrity, notoriety, and precarity then coalesce in the figure of the self-emancipator. Yet the genre conventions of the Western tend to romanticize a police power exercised by bounty hunters. Several scholars have noted that the history of outlawing has roots in ancient Greek slavery, where the slave was outside of society and its social and legal contracts. Bounty hunting, that is, taking payment for the delivery of criminalized bodies into the custody of the state, comes perilously close to the commodification of human beings in chattel slavery and its zombie afterlives in convict leasing and sharecropping. The premise of the film, They Die by Dawn, is a high-stakes game where four men with a bounty on their heads agree to a shootout, leaving the last man standing to claim the total reward on the other's heads. If the modern state still signs off on the commodification of criminalized bodies, these characters confiscate its power to determine and allot profit by seizing the capital for their own investment club, a burial society of sorts. In other words, They deploy their notoriety as fugitives from the law in order to redistribute capital within limits, of course. The people of Langston, Oklahoma, the town in which the film is set, gain nothing from this exercise, but at least there are no stray bullets in fiction. And I should say I'm not going to show any extract from the film. It's on Tidal, which means it can't be downloaded. But if anyone is curious afterwards, it's there for the viewing. The director, James Samuel, deploys celebrity on multiple levels. With an MC's braggadocio, he speaks the idiom of hip-hop production, where he himself has worked with multiple prominent artists as a producer. But his discourse also channels fan culture's hyper-enthusiasm, adding an extra cinematic patina to the celebrity notoriety dialectic at the core of his outlaw drama. This may be the tragic flaw of his own biography. He happens to be the younger brother of the megawatt star Seal. He perhaps overcompensates with his own star discourse, media producing his own celebrity in order to promote his film and vice versa. In 2013, Life and Times website breathlessly announced an exclusive interview with James Samuel discussing his film, They Die by Dawn, for the first time ever. The interview was a perfect vehicle for Samuel to emerge from the dim lighting of the production studio to take a star turn of his own. As Richard Dyer notes, stars are involved in making themselves into commodities. They are both labor and the thing that labor produces. The uncanny reminder of slaves as the only other category of people who have been commodities must be noted. Now, there is a paradox in Samuel's celebrity. His reputation is based on collaborative work in the hidden studio booths with elusive artists like J Electronica. But he's also actively involved in expanding his persona, publishing his music under the name The Bullets, yes, plural, and spelled with 2 L's and 2 T's. And he's not just hyperlinked, and if I didn't want to risk our tech stuff, I would show you the ways in which he's mapping that connection. But he's also interlinked with an eclectic A-list. The measure of his celebrity is precisely how he handpicks globally influential artists from the worlds of not just music, but also cinema. His creativity is celebrated for its frontier ethos. Beyond the boundary, quote, he embarks on unprecedented territory. Like some frontier scout, Samuel points us towards the El Dorado of access to the celebrities on whose exclusive friendships his own reputation is built. And one of the people that he announces, of course, is Idris Elba, who, in fact, was actually not in the film. But at the same time, Samuel's fandom aligns him with his audience's relation to the screen world. As Mathieu Diawara and Bell Hooks taught us, the pleasure of watching movies while black often requires resistant spectatorship. This is particularly true when watching Westerns. Laying aside the giant white elephant in the room, the abhorrent portrayals of Native Americans, and that's something I try and work with more robustly in other parts of this chapter, as well as the distorted and stereotyping portrayals of Chinese and Mexican Americans. There is much to vex black audiences in the whitening of the West that's so core to the cinematic genre. In Samuel's words, he says, I would watch Westerns because I love them so much, and I would get really, really frustrated. They never, ever show black people, and when they would, they'd give a reason for us being there. Samuel positions himself as fan rather than scholar, expert, producer. Quote, in the Old West, where black people were chilling, they were chilling. We were cowboys. There was Rufus Buck, Nat Love, Stagecoach Larry, Ben Hodges, John Taylor, all of these cowboys and cowgirls that we have never, ever learned about that weren't slaves. They were free and law-abiding citizens making a name for themselves. Two things to note here. Firstly, that slavery remains an important reference point even though the film is set in 1890. There's all sorts of plays with chronology in this, but in an early scene, a young Paul Lawrence Dunbar, who was born and raised in Ohio and would only have been 18 in 1890, is seen taking dictation from a barber named Jordan with a U. It's a play in the film. It doesn't make sense without it. Anderson is writing a letter to his former master some 25 years after emancipation. But why? As even he notes, there's little chance of recovering the wages he calculates he is owed for his forced labor. So I want to, and all of the characters who appear in the film have some sort of distortion in terms of their biographies, etc. They're all historic figures, but didn't all do the things that they do in the film. And I want to suggest that Samuel's dizzying remix of history announces itself as counterfeit. It wears that on its sleeve, and in so doing, it points out the unsustainability of white supremacist fables of the American West. He's not interested in correcting a historical record, but rather disorganizing the myth-making power of historical fictions. They Die by Dawn reveals how all tellings of the past are forgeries. And then the second thing here is the status of black bodies before the law versus before the camera. Making a name for oneself as fearless and fearsome is a central concern both diegetically and personally in this. In the final scene of the film, and spoiler alert, apologize, the sheriff reveals himself and confronts the last man standing in a shootout. The film ends with a gunshot fired and a quick cut to black, leaving us uncertain whether it's the outlaw or the law that wins the day. What is certain is that for Samuel, the tropes of banditry fascinate him. This becomes clear in the extent to which the TV show The Wire is referenced in the film. Describing his craft, Samuel says, "I take what I do seriously because it's my legacy." In the words of Marlo Stansfield from The Wire, "My name is my name. I'm fearless sonically. There's an assassination of rules." I think that language is amazing. He cast both Felicia Pearson and Michael K. Williams in the film, further evoking the TV series. And notably, we are reminded of Omar's signature whistling the "Hey Ho, the Dario" leitmotif from Smith, the Michael K. Williams character in the film, in that Nat Love, the character in this film, Williams in the TV show, Nat Love, the character in this film, announces himself by whistling the film's theme song, and his whistle becomes a leitmotif in a similar kind of way. Why does The Wire matter so much to Samuel? One reason, perhaps, is that the actors in the film made such a name for themselves, playing notorious and highly successful outlaws, that Samuel can essentially download that fame and glamour into They Die by Dawn. Fame pays, and infamy pays even more, even if it's only make-believe. By way of a speculative ending, I want to ask, might we begin to think about that repeatability, rebooting, recasting, and we could think about the Black Annie, Black Hermione, Black Bond, etc., as strategies that Samuel and others use for staging futurity in the face of the monotonous and ongoing spectacle of Black death through police violence and the right-wing psychosis that refuses to consider gun control. The only surprise is why some cases make the news and others don't. What if the dyad of celebrity and notoriety that Samuel exploits so effectively is a dialectic whose Aufhebung is the call to something like incantation, a repetition to remember, to grieve, to say her name, to celebrate her life, to make her an icon? And I'll close with this image, and to thank Sasha Panoram, whose beautiful dissertation chapter on Zong reminds us precisely that memorializations also generate icons. Thank you.
So I've spent a lot of time over the past 2 years thinking about the spatial relationship between state power and Black power. When I say state power, I mean the capacity of governing bodies at every level to regulate, control, and enforce their laws over populations. When I say Black power, I mean the capacity of Black people to defiantly determine their own destinies and to create livable worlds for themselves. I distinguish between these two things because I think that they are not only in conflict, but also, at least at this time, mutually exclusive. As an environmental social scientist, my primary interest is in understanding the spatial manifestations of socio-political relationships. I came to this particular work through encountering the practice of state power in spaces that Black folk had made into places over the course of centuries. These are places ranging from New Orleans East in Louisiana to the unincorporated community of Institute, West Virginia. I learned that Black placemaking was and is about Black power, about creating livable worlds where Black people could determine their own destinies by building their own institutions. And I came to each of these Black places because of environmental devastation, either present or pending. Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, an Institute, a pesticides plant that produced methyl isocyanate, which is the same chemical that killed thousands in the 1984 Union Carbide explosion in Bhopal, India. The abusive exercise of state power was a causal mechanism in each instance of environmental devastation in these Black places, through failures to invest in infrastructure, through refusals to regulate harmful industries, while crushing simultaneously community resistance, and through decisions to burden Black communities with state-owned hazards. For the Black people who lived in these places, there was little question that state power rarely, if ever, acted on their behalf. Some attempted to convert state power into Black power by running for public office, or through voter mobilization, or by, in one instance, joining the public agencies that were hostile to their communities in hopes of changing them. But the results of those efforts often left more to be desired than celebrated. There was some progress, but never unequivocal, and it's always too late for too many people. Black placemaking happened in spite of state power, not because of it. And Black power laid the groundwork and the infrastructure of these spaces. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about two Black places I've been recently, what they tell us about state power as it relates to Black power, and most importantly, what they can tell us about Black power as relates to the future of Black placemaking in spite of state power. And this research is part of a collaboration called In Conditions of Fresh Water, a multimedia Black spatial history project. The collaborators include myself, visual artist Torquase Dyson, who's on my right there, obviously, and community builders Omega and Brenda Wilson of the West End Revitalization Association, which is in Alamance County here in North Carolina, and Catherine Coleman Flowers of the Alabama Center for Rural Enterprise. Torquase and I traveled to Alamance and Lowndes counties last summer to collect oral histories of the unincorporated Black communities on the outskirts of Mebane, North Carolina, which is in Alamance County, and to the incorporated Black town of Whitehall in Lowndes County, Alabama. And we did this work in Torquase's Studio South Zero, which is a mobile solar-powered art studio which we converted into a parlor for our guests. So there are several literatures that guide my understanding of Black power and placemaking, namely geography, sociology, and law. However, there are two works that stand out for their theorization of Black space: Charles Mills's The Racial Contract and George Lipsitz's How Racism Takes Place. Mills's Racial Contract clarifies the traditional Western political theory of the social contract, arguing that the agreement of human beings to establish a civil society and government is in actuality an agreement for white people, the people who count, to establish group power and domination in the form of civil society and governance. State power, then, is institutionalized white power. The spatial manifestation of this racial contract requires a separation of spaces and consequently a development of racialized spatial imaginaries as articulated by George Lipsitz, which I'll get to in a second. But what I want to point out here is the section of the racial contracts that talks about how the racial contract normalizes and racist spaces. And that one of the interesting consequences of that contract is that the political space of the polity is not coextensive with the geographical space. And that when you're entering into non-white or black spaces, you're entering into spaces that are normatively discontinuous with white political space, where the rules are different in myriad of ways, which include the infrastructure disparities and environmental disparities that I've observed in my work. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about, first about the communities on the outskirts of Mebane, which is in Alamance County, North Carolina. The city of Mebane sits in the far east corner of Alamance County, crossing borders occasionally with Orange County, which you know is where Chapel Hill is in UNC if you're not from here. It was incorporated, Mebane was incorporated as a municipality in 1881, nearly 20 years after Black people established the communities of West End, East End, Buckhorn, and White Level in the areas adjacent. For 136 years, the majority of these communities, who contribute greatly both to the tax base and to the economy of the municipality, have remained outside the city limits of Mebane through a process that the geographer Charles Aiken calls municipal underbounding. And I'll show you here, you can see in the tan the sort of outline of Mebane. And in the sort of white pinkish on the outskirts, you can see we were in West End, but there's Perry Hill on the other side, Buckhorn, and White Level, which is actually further up. And these areas are all Black settlements that date back to the 1850s at least. And you can see also that the other 10 areas that are sort of look like they should not be part of Mebane are actually part of Mebane. And in fact, the city of Mebane skipped over the Black communities to incorporate these other places, extending infrastructure and environmental services to those areas. Okay, and the sewer plant is actually just on the outskirts of Mebane in West End, though most of those communities do not have access to wastewater sanitation, sewer services. So the process of municipal underbounding is this process of exclusionary annexation. When a municipality expands to take in more tax base, to expand development as it grows, it is discriminatory in the people that it includes within its polity, okay? So to take this further, the city of Mebane is also authorized by the state of North Carolina to exercise what's called extraterritorial jurisdiction over these communities on the outskirts for at least a mile outside of its city limits and up to 3 miles. This is the case for most municipalities across the state of North Carolina and in a lot of states across the country. What extraterritorial jurisdiction means is that the local government possesses land use regulatory power over these communities, despite the fact that the community members cannot vote in municipal elections. Okay, so it's kind of a taxation without representation situation. The environmental consequences of this socio-political arrangement are inaccess to basic public amenities such as drinking water, wastewater sanitation, sidewalks, or even fire-ready fire hydrants, which, as some of you know, if you own a home and you don't have access to a fire hydrant that could fight a fire, then your homeowner's insurance, it devastates your homeowner's insurance and all of the sort of protections that you have for your property. If you're thinking about the exchange value of your property over the long term and the appreciation of property. The Mebane wastewater treatment plant, as I've said, is located in the unincorporated community of West End, which has limited access to municipal sewer services, and I would add that most communities there do not drink the water. They haven't had anything confirmed. They said it smells funny, so they don't drink it. As part of these interviews, I interviewed Omega and Brenda Wilson, who are the founders of the West End Revitalization Association. Omega is from West End, and Brenda's actually from Philadelphia. So this is Omega talking about extraterritorial jurisdiction and what it means. And he says, I went to Orange County. I said his part of West End is on the Orange County side. So it gets a little complicated. So he said, I go to Orange County and they say, it's not our responsibility to give you these public amenities, it's the city of Mebane's responsibility. You go to the city of Mebane and they say, you're actually in the extraterritorial jurisdiction of Mebane, but you're under county rule. Go to the county about your issue with unpaved streets and lack of water. When we go back to the county says, yes, you're in the county, but the city of Mebane has asked us not to do anything in that part of the county because it's in their extraterritorial jurisdiction. And they control it. That's the reason why we haven't addressed any of those issues. And he leans in to me and he says, is that black enough for you? So I want to talk just briefly about, go back to George Lipsis's idea of the white spatial imaginary, which is being imposed, right, on this community, sort of to the exclusion, right, of the black communities on the outskirts of Mebane. And the idea is that it's based on exclusivity and augmented exchange value. It's a very capitalist form of development that says, instead of reaching out and providing services to communities, we are thinking only of who will meaningfully increase the property values in these areas. How can we take all of the resources to improve the services that accrue to us? And also promotes the quest for individual escape, rather than encouraging democratic deliberations about social problems and contradictory social relations that affect us all. By contrast, the black spatial imaginary, as Lipsis talks about, draws a distinct imaginary from the white spatial imaginary to oppose a land use philosophy that privileges profits over people. And this isn't anything innate, it's by necessity, right? Because they are excluded from the state power structure and state power land use authorities. They have to constantly advocate for inclusion. And so their perspective on this issue really is thinking about the use value rather than the exchange value of the properties. And the places in which they live, which structurally date back, right, to before or after, even before the Civil War, were in places like floodplains, places that were sold to them, or they were able to settle in, like we mentioned, the Marinage communities, and communities that were established after the Civil War that were purchased from former slave owners. And so they really have had this long history of really focusing more on the use value of places rather than the exchange values. And then there's also this emphasis on building community institutions to take care of the community's needs. And Eleanor Graves is also a resident of West End, or former resident of West End. She talked about growing up, the lack of regular municipal infrastructure, having the outhouses, depending on well water, but the community came together to build a community water spigot that would service the entire community. And then they said that when the county first came through with running water, rather than providing the service of digging the water pipes themselves, her brothers actually had to dig about 1,000 feet to physically connect the homes onto the property. And so there is like literally a necessity, right, for that kind of community-based power in order to literally build the literal infrastructure of these communities. Cheeks' Crossing, which is another community that is that is close by West End, just a bit farther out. Carolyn Poteet talks about how the families were close at that time. This is around the 50s and 60s, because everyone was basically on the same level. And she said, when you're on the same level, you're reaching for the same things. And so there's a sense of sharing and a sense of community, because we can't, the implication is we can't rely on the state to build our grocery stores or for white shopkeepers to come in and build these things. We build those things ourselves, and we utilize the resources we have and share, because our perspective is that we are at the same level. And she talks a little bit later about how that's changed, and I'll talk a little bit about that in the context of Lowndes County in a second. So we went from the unincorporated Black communities on the outskirts of Mebane, North Carolina, to an incorporated, relatively recently incorporated Black town of Whitehall, Alabama, which is in Lowndes County, which is also in the Alabama Black Belt. And so the town of Whitehall sits in the northeast corner of Lowndes County, in the Alabama Black Belt, and it's called, if you recall the book Bloody Lowndes by Hassan Jeffries. It was called Bloody Lowndes because of its historic reputation for anti-Black white supremacist violence. And it was also, if you know this story, the hub of SNCC activities, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee activities around voting rights and freedom rights from 1965 to 1966. And there have been attempts to capture state power through county elections with a Black Power Freedom Rights platform, and actually which manifested in the first, we call the first Black Panther Party, the Lowndes County Freedom Organization. That petition, that effort failed in 1966. And at that time, John Jackson, who was a local, who joined SNCC at, I think around the age of 14, decided to go from the county level to try to focus on building power at the municipal level. And so he fought to incorporate his community into the town of Whitehall. And they were incorporated in 1979. He became the mayor in 1980. And the purpose of incorporation is that it authorizes state recognition, which means that it creates an eligibility for the kind of place-making powers that you might want, eligibility for state and federal funding to build infrastructure, those things that are typically unavailable to unincorporated communities unless they can create some kind of regional authority. But what we found really quickly, what they found really quickly was that merely incorporating wasn't enough to gain that kind of access. So as an example, their sewer system is just now being installed now. It costs $1.2 million, which is mostly loans that the municipality has to come up with. The municipality at this point services 600 homes. This sewer system is only going to cover 44 of them. And they waited 15 years for that. So, and to make matters even more complicated, because of other infrastructure challenges, the sewer lagoon, which is the structure that they're going to build there, actually has to go behind an elementary school. So there are all sorts of compounding infrastructural challenges that incorporating itself has not resolved. So just to say a little bit about the interviews that we held in Whitehall. This is Lyndon Fitzgerald White, who's in the green shirt. He and his cousin Ben are actually brick masons, and so they came to do the interview right after work. So their clothes were a little. And so he was talking. So Lyndon White was born actually in 1965 after the Voting Rights March, and he talked a little bit about. But he remembers being 10, and on the 10th anniversary of the Voting Rights March, from Selma to Montgomery. So Lowndes County is that stretch, that county that the Voting Rights March sort of marched straight directly through. And he talked about how the KKK came through on the 10th anniversary and said that they were going to erase King's March by marching that entire route. So they did that. And he talks about how it was scary and exciting at the same time, right, to see these mythical figures, right, come right by his house, right, because the area where he lives is right on Highway 80 on that march route. But what he says at the end is that, and this got cut off, is that what black folks did after they had already marched for the 10th anniversary, the KKK came, they went back and marched again, okay, to really, really take back the space. And then Ruby Rudolph, who is actually Lyndon White's aunt, talks a little bit about what I was hinting at before, is that there's a shift in the black placemaking ideas and the black power ideals that used to exist in these spaces. And what she said was that, once the civil rights era was over, there was this push that started to look a lot like the white spatial imaginary. This push towards individualism, this push towards a capture of individual power. And so she says, our town has been torn down by wannabes in power. And it shouldn't be about power, it should be about helping people. And our town was thriving at one point when we had people who wanted to do things and did it gracefully, and we didn't have a lot of money to do stuff with. But you have to be together and you have to be united in order for so many things the things that we were managed to accomplish in Lowndes County. And so she's lamenting sort of the downfall of that ethic and the rise of a kind of individualist ethic. So I want to close by thinking about the future of black placemaking. I think one of the things that became clear to us, and we're still sort of sorting through the ideas here, is that there's a very clear demonstration historically and contemporarily of a kind of black spatial imaginary, a sort of continuous sort of push against state power for black self-determination, which could not, just to say, have happened without black land ownership and those other sorts of essential matters. But it is very clear, right, that there's a clearly antagonistic and mutually exclusive relationship between state power and black power, and you can see that manifest spatially. I think the question for the future is what do we do now that Ruby Rudolph talks about everything has changed. It feels like we've lost a kind of community ethic in a lot of these spaces. People have been drawn in. It's not only that people are moving away to other cities or bigger places. It's that there's a sense that maybe we can rely more on state power to build black power. And I think that she's a city, and just to say, she's a city councilwoman for Whitehall now, and got involved because of this tension, because she's like, we're not the way that we used to be, and I don't know how we get back there. So I was reading Catherine McKittrick and Clyde Woods' Black Geographies, and one of the things that they suggest is that inserting black geographies, inserting the narratives of places like West End, Cheeks Crossing, and Whitehall into our worldview, and thinking about the ways in which they operated and the institutions that they had to build that were counter, right, to the sort of in spite of the state power, can really give us the kind of emancipatory strategies to move away from the kind of territoriality and then sort of the white spatial imaginary, essentially. And this kind of normative or white normative practice of staking a claim to place. And, I don't know where we are at this moment with that I guess, with that idea, right? But I do think that in these interviews, the question, right, even if people aren't thinking in this very theoretical lens, the question is coming up. You know, maybe the things that we had relied on before worked. And especially in this era in which we have state power that is increasing in its encroachment into Black and brown lives particularly, perhaps there's an opportunity for us to start to think more and more back to those institutions that that were the foundations of the original Black places. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you. I begin with two epigraphs. Now the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the face of the waters. Genesis 1:2. And the other one, it's terrible to have come from nothing but the sea, which is nowhere, navigable only in its constant auto-dislocation. And that's from Fred Moten in his essay, Blackness and Nothingness. In a passage from the interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano, the significance of which can hardly be overstated, the former slave Equiano offers his first-hand account of the water that there was in the beginning. Quote, "The first object which saluted my eyes when I arrived on the coast was the sea and a slave ship, which was then riding at anchor and waiting for its cargo. These filled me with astonishment, which was soon converted into terror when I was carried on board. I was immediately handled and tossed up to see if I were sound by some of the crew, and I was now persuaded that I had gotten into a world of bad spirits, and that they were going to kill me," end quote. This passage is, in the first case, significant insofar as it documents what Frank Roderson has called, referring to the middle passage, the, quote, dawning of blackness, or, quote, the Black's first ontological instance, end quote. Here we witness Equiano's original interpolation as Black and a slave at the historical moment where these terms become perfect synonyms. This passage also documents, for that matter, the white's first ontological instance, in the sense that white skin acquires new meaning as a signifier for not only not a slave or free, but also human. Still, we have not fully appreciated this passage until we recognize that in it dawns not just blackness or whiteness, but an entire and attendant world, which is the claim that what we witness in this incredibly significant passage from Equiano's narrative is nothing short of a veritable genesis, the creation of a world, the new world, as it were, which Equiano had gotten into, and which we might alternatively call reflecting what many maintain as the centrality of slavery to any viable account of modernity, the modern world. To further elucidate this point, notice the resonances between the bad spirits hovering over the face of the Atlantic and that watery scene of beginning which is famously illustrated in the opening verses of the book of Genesis. In the beginning, quote, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was without shape and empty, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters," end quote. While in the Genesis account of creation, it's darkness and the Spirit of God that we find hovering over the face of the deep. In what I am suggesting we read as Equiano's narration of the creation of the New World, it is rather the bad spirit of whiteness and an ontologically demoted blackness that we find hovering over the face of the Atlantic aboard the slave ship. And having gotten into this world of bad spirits, Equiano significantly is persuaded that he is going to die. We can isolate the creation of this new world of slavery, the precise moment of its Big Bang, so to speak, in the conversion at its center, the transformation of the astonishment that initially characterizes Equiano's emotional encounter with the ocean into terror. This emotional conversion signals another implicit and more basic conversion, realized at precisely the moment Equiano is carried on board. That is, the moment Equiano realizes that the ship waiting for its cargo is waiting for him, that he is the cargo for which the slave ship waits. It's this conversion of a man into a black man, into a slave, of a person into an exchangeable and fungible commodity, I argue, that constitutes the epicenter around which the new or modern world and its attendant social configurations of the human into citizens belonging to nation states all reverberate into existence. Yet, Equiano's persuasion that he had gotten into a world of bad spirits notwithstanding, this conversion should furthermore be recognized as affecting a radical exclusion. In other words, this into should not be mistaken for inclusion in this world, which is a white world, a world created by and in the bad spirit of whiteness. Rather, we know by his conviction that this world of bad spirits was going to kill him, that Equiano has been included only as he who is to be killed. His position, then, relative to this world may be more precisely theorized as an inclusive exclusion, which is to say that Equiano had gotten into this world of bad spirits only as its constitutive and committed outside. He is included as the eternally excluded, and it is in fact his exclusion which creates and defines this white world in which he is not. This is precisely what Wilderson argues in Red, White, and Black when he asserts that, quote, the imaginary of the state and civil society is parasitic on the Middle Passage. Put another way, no slave, no world, and in addition, no slave is in the world, end quote. The world, whose creation we witness in the Middle Passage then, is founded upon and sustained in the radical exclusion of blackness, and is in this way constitutionally anti-black. It is little wonder then that Equiano believed that these bad spirits in their world were going to kill him. In fact, being just what it is, such a world could do nothing else. While given the specific circumstances of his life, we might expect Equiano to illustrate the dawning of blackness in terms of water. Richard Wright offers a similar portrait of blackness's beginnings in his classic 1940 novel, Native Son. In an understudied passage from the concluding chapter of Wright's novel, significantly titled Fate, Wright depicts a despondent Bigger Thomas, the novel's protagonist, resigning himself to his impending execution after being apprehended by the police for his accidental and racially overdetermined murder of a white woman. Quote, having felt in his heart some obscure need to be at home with people and failed, Bigger chose not to struggle anymore. With a supreme act of will springing from the essence of his being, he turned away from his life and the long train of disastrous consequences that had flowed from it, and looked wistfully upon the dark face of the ancient waters, upon which some spirit had breathed and created him, the dark face of the waters from which he had been first made in the image of a man, with a man's obscure need and urge, feeling that he wanted to sink back into those waters and rest eternally, end quote. I propose that by ancient waters, Wright immediately intends the Atlantic Ocean. Yet by casting these troubled waters in the familiar rhetoric of Genesis, I argue that he also means to ascribe to them a cosmological import. To, as we have observed with Equiano, once again credit them, and by extension the event of Middle Passage, with the creation of a world. And since Wright situates this portrait of Bigger's resignation to his death in a chapter titled Fate, it would appear that he too, like Equiano, had gotten into a world that was going to, because fated to, kill him. Furthermore, by employing the rhetoric of Genesis, I submit that Wright also means to signal to his readers, which would include us today, that so far as our world is concerned, we had just as well refer to Middle Passage in order to satisfy our cosmological curiosity about where it all comes from than to open a Bible. Here is the beginning of your world, Wright tells us, here on the face of this deep. Yet, for all of the ways in which he intentionally imitates the rhetoric of Genesis, Wright's rendering of the beginning nonetheless differs from the Genesis account in one glaringly significant way. Whereas in Genesis, God, quote, formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, end quote, Wright informs us that it was rather immediately and directly upon the water that some spirit had breathed and created Bigger. And what better culprit for Bigger's unorthodox creation than those bad spirits we find pushing wind with their sails across the face of the Atlantic in Equiano's narrative? By thus distinguishing the creation of the black man from the creation of man universal, Wright illustrates the origins of blackness in the black man's or slave's exclusion from the ontological property that Western or universal man otherwise claims mythically and historically in the ground. In this way, the beginning of blackness, relative to whiteness, takes the specific form of an original and originating divestment of ground and a corresponding commitment to the water, so that the crisis of having no ground, which the ancient waters visited upon the souls of slaves thrown overboard the slave ship, yields a physical dramatization of what is also and already metaphysically true of their ontological standing in the New World. Concomitantly, Wright implies an ideological construction of whiteness, or the human, that takes the specific form of an original and originating ontological claim to and in the ground, in a way not all that unlike the evolutionary narration of the human as a biped, that is, as distinguished from the rest of the animal kingdom and nature by the ability to stand on 2 feet, the capacity to stand one's ontological ground, as it were, within and atop the hierarchy of nature. In this way, water indexes what Wright gives us to understand as blackness's constitutive and originating crisis of having no ground, a crisis initiating with and subsequently haunted by the ancient waters of Middle Passage. In this way, the water that there was in the beginning lays bare the barest and most essential feature of what Du Bois has famously described in terms of the problem of being black, which it turns out is not primarily or at all a matter of coerced labor that can be remedied with the mere abolition of slavery, or human rights violations that can be amended by the gains of the civil rights movement, but rather, and most fundamentally, a condition of radical exclusion, often theorized in the field of black studies as the condition of social death. And something like social death is indexed in the inevitable failure of Bigger Thomas's, quote, obscure need to be at home with people, end quote. Though for reasons I will soon explore, I stopped short of describing black life in the utterly abject terms of Orlando Patterson's notion of social death. Nonetheless, it should be recognized that it is in fact the failure of Bigger and those like Bigger to be at home with people which constitutes the condition of possibility for people, that is, white people, to be at home with one another in the first place, which is why Woderson argues in Red, White, and Black that as a, quote, ontological position, the slave is not a laborer, but an anti-human, a position against which humanity establishes, maintains, and renews its coherence, its corporeal integrity, end quote. Since the end of Bigger's struggle to be at home with people takes the specific form of sinking into the ancient waters of Middle Passage, Wright suggests the ways in which the slave's anti-humanity takes the specific form of what, relative to whiteness, is an opposing inability to stand your ground. But if, in this first instance, we have meant problem in the more popular sense of, or the more dominant sense of, quote, a matter or situation regarded as unwelcome, harmful, or wrong and needing to be overcome, end quote, we will now transition to thinking the problem of being black in the more open sense of, quote, a question of academic discussion, end quote, which you'll notice, in contrast to the former connotation, has yet to determine decisively whether the problem of being black is an unwelcome one or not, and thus leaves open the possibility for some other understanding of or orientation toward blackness than that of a problematic condition, i.e. social death, needing to be overcome. More specifically, we will consider the extent to which blackness's origins in the water might, beyond some definitive account of the beginning, gesture more significantly to an ethic for beginning, one which has much more to do with social life, I propose, than social death. Given the way that we have understood the problem of being black to inhere in a crisis of having no ground, originating with and haunted by the waters of Middle Passage, Equiano's reaction to his initial confrontation with the brutal violence of slavery comes as a bit of a surprise. He writes, quote, 2 of the white men offered me eatables, and on my refusing to eat, one of them held me fast by the hands and laid me across, I think, the windlass and tied my feet, while the other flogged me severely. I had never experienced anything of this kind before, and although, not being used to the water, I naturally feared that element the first time I saw it, yet nevertheless could I have got over the nettings I would have jumped over the side, end quote. That as an escape from the incredible violence of slavery, Equiano would wish to hasten the death for which he already anticipated the new world of slavery was designed, is simple enough to grasp. What's surprising, however, is that for which Equiano went looking in the water, not, at least in the first instance and only death, but life. Consider Equiano's peculiar description of those slaves who had managed to successfully jump over the side. Quote, "Often did I think many of the inhabitants of the deep much more happy than myself. I envied them the freedom they enjoyed, and often wished I could change my condition for theirs," end quote. Equiano uses inhabitants, a word typically reserved for the living, to describe those we otherwise know to be dead. And what's more, he claims to envy these slaves their freedom. Thus, if blackness dawns on the face of the Atlantic, it would seem from this passage that this dawning proceeds not only as an ocean-induced crisis of having no ground, but perhaps paradoxically also as a willful inhabitation of the deep, which harbors significant insights for how we might alternatively imagine life and freedom. Indeed, I propose that if we forgive Equiano's apparent misnaming of the drowned and take seriously the lives that were lived underwater, awfully abbreviated as they were, then what emerges is an intensely precarious and profoundly ecological vision of life and freedom. We might better understand what's at stake in a claim like this by returning once again and by way of conclusion to Bigger Thomas in order to consider how else Richard Wright renders Bigger's resignation to his death. Here, cast in the broader terms of a merger with the natural world rather than the more specific image of sinking into the ancient waters from which Bigger was created. Quote, "The feelings of Bigger's body reasoned that if there could be no merging with men and women about him, there should be a merging with some other part of the natural world in which he lived. Out of the mood of renunciation, there sprang up in him again the will to kill, but this time it was not directed outward toward people, but inward upon himself. This feeling sprang up of itself organically, automatically, like the rotted hull of a seed forming the soil in which it should grow again." What are we to make, end quote, what are we to make of Bigger's desire to merge with the natural world in the face of a racial interdiction against being at home with men and women, whose very being as men and women Wright constructs as deriving from whiteness's ontological and mythological property in the dry ground? I'm not sure that Wright recognizes in this merging with the natural world anything beyond death, but that is not to say that we can't. In fact, I propose that the very fact that this merger with the natural world would affect a corresponding exclusion from human society puts pressure on the notion of blackness as social death by calling into question the sincerity of the human sociality that is the referent of this social. It reveals the human social of social death as ecologically deficient and impoverished, insofar as it implicitly excludes the natural world in addition to those racialized as non-white. In this sense, I want to propose that, far from social death, inhabitation of the deep, when recognized as exclusion from a social configuration of the human that is itself asocial and anti-ecological, actually uniquely positions blackness to think and enact a more genuinely social, because also ecological life, which is to claim that blackness gets down in the water just as much as it is cast down, wades in the water in which it is weighed, refuses the land refused to it. Dion Brand, in her book of poems, Land to Light On, articulates this refusal well. Quote, "You come to this, here is the marrow of it. Not moving, not standing, it's too much to hold up. What I really want to say is, I don't want no fucking country. Here or there and all the way back, I don't like it, none of it, easy as that. I'm giving up on land to light on," end quote. What would it mean to think inhabitation of the deep then, not as blackness's problem to be overcome, but the ethical refusal of whiteness's assorted lands to light on, of the grounds whiteness stands. What if, relative to a reductive notion of standing your ground as territory or private property and habitation of the deep, elaborates an ethical posture of being in the world that, in giving up on land to light on, as Brand so wonderfully puts it, consents to the precarious and ecological conditions of life on a planet predominantly made of water? What if the future of blackness is in the beginning, not as a point of origin per se, but rather as an ethical practice of consenting to hover over the face of the deep? So by way of conclusion, and to further elucidate this final point, consider with me this passage from Being and Nothingness, in which Sartre narrates his understanding of the ontological drama set in motion with the, quote, appearance of the other in the world. Quote, thus, suddenly an object has appeared which has stolen the world from me. Everything is in place, everything still exists for me, but everything is traversed by an invisible flight and fixed in the direction of a new object. The appearance of the other in the world corresponds, therefore, to a fixed sliding of the whole universe, to a decentralization of the world which undermines the centralization which I am simultaneously effecting, end quote. I am interested in Sartre's interpretation of the other as that which not only puts the world to flight, which is interesting in itself insofar as this fugitive world resists its own territorialization in the form of private property, but also that which sets the world flowing. For now that the other has seen me, Sartre writes, it appears that, quote, this is a quote, it appears that the world has a kind of drain hole in the middle of its being, and that it is perpetually flowing off through the hole, end quote. What if we were to understand this phenomenon, not as a crisis, but rather as the gracious lesson of all alterity, both human and non-human? What would it mean to be open to the terra firma flowing beneath our feet, as the given ground of human being, as the real situation of life, and not that which we might seek to consolidate or stabilize? What if, when we met each other, we consented to walk on water, to be found upon the given relations that give us, and so in this way to join the ranks of the inhabitants of the deep? To what black futures might such black beginning give rise? Thank you.
So all I really wanted to evoke was there's so many kind of global connections that I could see and kind of resonances with other regions. So I thought I would just raise a few. In Tsitsi's case, Abderrahmane Sissoko, who's this Malian film director, recounts how the first movies he saw were all spaghetti westerns, this aesthetic, right? Yeah. And so I probably knew, I know you knew that, but I thought it was a fascinating connection. And also Eliza Dandridge, who's a student here, is working on the ways in which the bande dessinée, the comic strips of in 60s and 70s in France, the Western gets utilized as a way to narrate the Algerian War in this kind of reverse, right, with the indigenous as the heroes of that conflict. So, for Danielle, which was such fascinating work, and what I couldn't help think about was just the links to various imperial and particularly Caribbean contexts where this sort of same struggle goes on, and the whole kind of deep history of family land and in like places like Jamaica and Haiti. And, so often I think these struggles are not they're not connected, theorized together, but there's such a parallel, and so I just thought that's like a really rich set of connections to explore, so thank you for that. And for Jonathan, again, really wonderful analysis and opens up so much space, and I also couldn't help to think about all the ways in which, in Haitian Vodou particularly, and other African Atlantic religions, the deep is kind of theorized and celebrated in a certain way, in Vodou in particular, in song and ritual and dance, and there's this kind of sense that one actually continues to inhabit that deep, and it's kind of called up and becomes a space of sustenance in some of those contexts. So those were some resonances I saw. So let me open it up now for questions from the audience.
I guess what I wanted to start with Jonathan and the brilliant referencing and carrying us back to our beginnings. I'm a former life coach, so I dwell there often and look forward to summer in light of what it is now. It brings to mind a sort of revisitation in this notion of future blackness and speculation You know, what we see as very prominently made clear with Parliament, George Clinton, and Motor Booty Affair. We can dance underwater and not get wet. That whole notion of bring Atlantis to the top. But then there are other referencings via the music, because that's where I dwell quite a bit, with Drexia and their whole notion of the mythic worlds. And so I was wondering if those are familiar with you and if you could bring those into your discussion at all.
Yeah. Drexia is really exciting. The genre of music is quite foreign to me, so I came to Drexia by way of interest in the mythology surrounding the music.
What is Drexia?
So Drexia is, and maybe you can help me a bit with at least the genre. I forget what.
Well, if we want to call it, we could certainly call it a certain electronic or house music. It originates out of Detroit.
Detroit, yep.
It's very clear that their claim is firm, terra firma for sure. But it's built around the notion that there is a mythic world of our ancestors that are there, that have maintained existence there and beyond, and that world comes from those who survived going overboard.
Yeah. So
existing in the underworld.
yeah. So the idea is that pregnant mothers who were thrown overboard or jumped overboard gave birth to beings who were born with gills, and so they live underwater. And so Drexia is inspired sort of by this mythology, and is a mythology that corresponds with their musical output. It's interesting because aesthetically, I'm not that familiar with electronic music, but when you listen to it, there's a lot of repetition. It is sort of trance. It induces a sort of trance that sort of, for me, recalls the experience, as Glissant describes it in Poetics of Relation, of middle passing slaves. Glissant has this wonderful question that he ventriloquizes of slaves who, taken from the interior of West Africa, were encountering the ocean for the very first time and had no sort of concept of the landless realm of the deep sea. And the question he provides us with to help us imagine what the sort of vicissitudes of that kind of experience is, what kind of river has no middle? And that's kind of the sense that you get when you listen to Drexia. It's this sort of trance. It's just and a repetition and loops that just stretch out unendingly. So yeah, Drexia is a really amazing reference, and I think there's things like that, a sort of Black Atlantis kind of imaginaries, are all throughout the literature. And so an important play for me that comes up in my work is August Wilson's Gem of the Ocean. And there, the sort of the drama of the play turns on this mythological journey to this place called the City of Bones. And the way that August Wilson describes it is, this is the city that slaves who didn't survive the passage built underneath the ocean, and they made the city out of their own bones. And so there's this constant, I think, and part of what my work tries to get at or tries to think about is this insistence upon claiming claiming the underwater space as a space for life, or a space within which we might imagine, alternatively imagine life. Yeah, so thank you for your question. Yeah.
I could keep it going by asking Cece, how can we see that film of Sam?
So you have to subscribe to Tidal, even if it's only for a month, and it's streaming on their video menu. I've tried to figure out how to illegally download it, etc. Because I have talked about this film a couple of times, and I do want to write about it, etc. But it made the rounds of film festivals before, was it the Notorious 9 or Hateful Eight? Sorry, okay, which is important. And he has talked about wanting to make a full-length version of it, but that was I guess maybe 50-odd minute version of it. But he also had a album by the same name. The music is not the same on the two, but clearly he's interested in storytelling, and music plays a big role in the film. I know I just kind of skate on the surface of that, but there's a lot going on with it.
Yeah, thank you very much for those presentations. The question I have, I think, links the legal end issue with the water. And my experience in the Caribbean studies, that one reference that I remember seeing that was really fascinating that tried to talk about Blackness as an experience as opposed to kind of a pigmentation is a reference from a French naturalist who's astonished to note that the white sailors are also called black. There's a reference to white sailors as also living a difficult life, of also being thrown out on the water, of also maybe never being there before. And it's kind of a note in Creole kind of etymology that he's saying that this word Negro or Negra is also referred to on the seas as the sailors. And so making me think about the possibilities of water being a solvent of erasing histories on one hand, and then I guess when I move over, I'm just thinking, could you remind me of Mr. Okay, your name again? Danielle. My family is from Mississippi, and so the past 10 years I've had this opportunity to put my Caribbean framework in little towns in the South as a personal thing. And so how can you compare poor white, unincorporated or incorporated with the statistics that exist among blacks? And the difference with islands is that everyone is just kind of on a rock, and American slavery has allowed for this, these differences to exist. Not necessarily segregation, but just a different social order, and that's kind of like one thing that's noted. And so, because I wonder if that would also be able to pinpoint certain commonalities which exist and the differences, and if it is about race or is it about poverty, because the Appalachia has its own history, and so I'm curious to know how if that's possible in these areas. So that's kind of a similar question.
I'll defer. I'll let you go.
Sure. So it's a great question. It's actually, this project is a spin-off of my dissertation research, which is actually looking at this incorporated, unincorporated community distinction along race lines. And so part of the exploration will be to think about white incorporated and unincorporated communities that are in close geographic proximity to these black towns, and how they differ in terms of their access to these kinds of services. One narrative that I'm remembering that Omega Wilson told me is that, and this is really interesting, is that, so there are some white unincorporated communities that are also around Mebane, farther out, so they're not in the extraterritorial jurisdiction of the city. So it's a different kind of relationship. But what he was saying is that as his organization, the Western Revitalization Association, was gaining more traction in this fight, they call it the fight for basic amenities. These community members who used to show up at city council meetings to actually jeer at them as they were confronting city council members, actually approach them about, well, maybe you can help get us some amenities too. So and the implication was that it was interesting, like, they might be able to curry particular favors from the city of Mebane, right? Like some individuals had been able to reach out and get some access to, like maybe get a sewer line like extended right out to their communities. But it clearly hadn't happened on a community level. And there wasn't the kind of organization and resistance from those communities. But when they saw that Omega Wilson in the West End was starting to gain some traction, they were like, well, hey, like, what about us, right? So there is clearly, right, like some of that commonality, and I'm interested in sort of teasing out a little more about what's happening in those sort of class-based relationships between these white communities, right, and who gains access, who feels like they can organize and speak out, and why that haven't they in some cases. But yeah, so that's just one example that comes to mind.
Do you want to respond at all, or
I don't know how we're doing on.
Is there another? Let's take another question then. Yeah, if you mind.
Thanks. I just want to echo what others have said, and thanking you for your presentation. I'm really fascinated by what Danielle and, well, by all of your work, but what Danielle talked about in terms of the need for us to move away from territoriality, that quote from McKittrick and Woods. And then this whole idea from Jonathan of, the possibility of the future of Blackness not being about lighting upon land, but hovering over the deep. It's so interesting to me because it makes me think about gentrification. And, I live in Raleigh, I teach at St. Augustine's University, and that's in Southeast Raleigh. And the horror that is being wrought on that Black community by all of the development, people being kicked out, evicted by their landlords so that they can sell their property to developers and blah, blah, blah. It's just, I'm always thinking about how can we apply this theory to, in a practical manner to solve some of our real issues. And I just feel like there's so much potential in, I don't know how we're going to hold over the deep, like literally, but I wonder about just actually this sort of a spiritual concept of letting the land go, like letting the space go, so that the trauma of trying to hold on to it is not something that we internalize and it actually destroys us. And I wonder, do you see any parallels in your work, or is there anything that you can speak to in relation to gentrification as far as what you've been talking about?
Well, I'd say that upon listening to Danielle's talk and what she spoke of in terms of Black placemaking, or understanding Black power in relationship to Black placemaking, that was really exciting. I saw immediately resonances between my work and your own, in a way, and in a way I think that while I sometimes can think very theoretically, actually the way that you elaborate very practically about Black power and Black practices of Black placemaking, I thought were sort of like the practical application of what I was sort of theorizing on a more theoretical plane. I don't know if you felt similarly, but that was was my response to listening to your work.
I used to actually go to camp out there, and I don't recognize anything, like at the YMCA, right? Like I don't recognize anything out there anymore as I grew up in this area. And also Durham. I mean, it's just, I grew up here in Durham. It's just a really, really a vastly different kind of space now. It's a really, really great question. I mean, and, I'm struggling with this because I think there's some paradoxes that are going on with, I remember talking to Catherine Flowers, who I didn't quote here, but how she talked about, she said off the bat, she was like, no one is talking about the fact that it would have been impossible for the freedom rights movement in Lowndes County and in some other places, but particularly Lowndes County, to have occurred the way it did without Black land ownership, right? And I was like, you're right, because there was no way that SNCC could have come in and lived on that land. There were all of these ways in which, like, structurally our system has created like these particular kinds of necessities that encourage territoriality even when we know, right, that like this isn't ultimately the thing that liberates us, right? And so I think that that's what's really difficult. I think like and that's why I was struggling, right, when reading Black Geographies, is like, wow, yeah, like we do need to let it go, and it's like been the tool, like one of the tools that we've utilized to get us to where we are, right? So I struggle with that, and I think that what it means is that like we actually have to like rid ourselves of this entire system, right? So like what it would mean, right, to like burn it all down, to be like, hey, we have to like there can be no more, right? Private property, right? Like there can, in order to rid ourselves of all of these things, like these actual structures, which we know have their origins. I mean, that's why I think the racial contract was so really essential for this work, to think about like, gosh, like the origins of how we think about private property, of how we think about governance, about polities, and then extending it to think about like, what is a municipality? But right, like this idea of like this white power governance structure in sort of in miniature, right? And what it means for the communities on the outskirts. So yeah, I think that kind of is the answer. And then the question is like, how do you get there if the tools that we've been using? So I feel like we're in this kind of very bizarre moment. It's really a great question, and I'm like asking myself that on a daily basis. So yeah, I think that it's got to go, but how? And I don't know the answer to that right now.
It's been an amazing beginning to an amazing 2 days, so thank you very much.